Hi. Um, I've done a video about this once before. I want to do another video about it because this just keeps nagging at me and nagging at me, and I've tried to find info on it and I've asked questions about it, and everybody wants to quote what it says, but nobody wants to explain what it means. And that is the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, which was made about, I want to say 1787, somewhere around in there. It was eradicated, which means that everybody agreed on it and they put it into practice. Now, it says here that the Ninth Amendment says that the rights of the people, or the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And I ask what retained by the people means. The rights that are not written down. Now, this is what I've come across, and I'm going to talk about it here. It says here, the Ninth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is one of the least referred to amendments in decisions of the Supreme Court. For some odd reason, they don't like it. I don't know why they don't like it, but it's there for a very specific purpose. The Founding Fathers put it there for a reason. And it says here, it is also one of the most confusing, controversial, and misunderstood amendments to the Constitution. This amendment reserves all rights not listed in the Constitution to the people, which means that there's certain rights, the First Amendment right, which is right to free speech and so on, and there's other rights, such as the Second Amendment, which gives us the right to bear arms and things. Now, the government, the original Founding Fathers, realized that if they decided to create the amendments and write them down, there were way too many of them to write on paper. They would spend the rest of their lifetime trying to write them down. So they put the Ninth Amendment in there to secure other people's rights. Now, back when the Founding Fathers started America, they were smart, and they assumed that future government down the road was going to be as smart as they are. They did not think that future government was going to be selfish and stupid and self-centered. They didn't realize that future government was going to try to take away the rights of the people and turn them into privileges, which you could go to jail for. I just recently went to court for driving without a license, which I am not a driver, I am a traveler, and I've done a video on Title 18. I've done a video on US 18, subsection 31, video or two back, where it explains the federal definition of what a driver is and what a motor vehicle is, regardless of what the states want you to think it is or what they say it is, and whether or not the Supreme Court of the United States tells them they're wrong. There is a legal definition of that, and I argued that that right that I had to free travel using my automobile was a right retained by the people. It was part of the rights that were retained by the people. Now, Supreme Court justices in the day, back in the early 1900s especially, when automobiles were not like they are now, they believed that automobiles were a mode of transportation protected under life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They are private property, therefore they are protected. Now, upon doing that, the Supreme Court would always go against people that said, yeah, but what about safety this, and we need to do that, and blah, blah, blah. They said that you would be protected not only in your person, but in your good conduct, which means that if you are not doing anything that would draw unwanted attention unto yourself, and you are not jeopardizing someone else's freedom and putting anybody else at risk, then you should be able to travel upon the highways and the byways and the public places and your private property automobile. Citizens, on the other hand, have decided that they don't want law. Citizens, on the other hand, have decided that they don't want freedom. They want law. They don't want freedom. They want comfort. Just having a driver's license does not mean that you know how to operate a motor vehicle or how to operate an automobile, which is totally separate from a motor vehicle. The federal government has designated that. So, the Ninth Amendment is supposed to protect that right, the right to free travel using the mode of transportation of the day. But they don't. Anytime you argue the Ninth Amendment, they just say, oh, it's just there. It doesn't really mean nothing. So I asked this question, what does it mean when it says rights that are retained by the people? It says that they are not construed to deny or disparage other rights just because there's several rights that are written down in the Constitution, several amendments. That does not mean that those are the only ones that are out there. But who decides what is a right and what isn't? That's the question. Now it says here the purpose of the Ninth Amendment is clear. The amendment's purpose is clear. The Bill of Rights mentions certain rights that are to be protected from government interference. These rights include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to keep and bear arms, among others. Just because a right is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights, though, does not mean that the government automatically has the right to interfere with it. Instead, the Ninth Amendment says that any right not enumerated or listed in the Constitution is still retained by the people. So in plain language, it means that there are other rights that people have that are not listed in the Constitution. And again, I ask this question, who decides what is a right and what isn't? Is it only a right if you cannot make money off of it? Is it only a right if it's written down? If freedom of speech was not written down, but it was one of those rights that was covered by the Ninth Amendment, would it be covered by the Ninth Amendment? Would we be able to use that right? Would the government understand that it is a right? I don't think so. I think it has to be written down before the government can take it serious. Now, it says here, the Founding Fathers realized that they could not possibly list every natural right of a human being that needed protection. Instead, they delegated certain powers to the government that were specifically spelled out in the Constitution and said, everything else is left up to the individuals and to their states, not individual states. Origin of the Bill of Rights. Original Bill of Rights. What is a natural right? Natural rights are those rights that people have just because they are human. Like the right to breathe, which I guess that would be under life. You have the right to live. Natural rights are those rights that people have just because they are human. They are natural to mankind and should not be violated by the government. So, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from cruel and unusual punishment were judged by the Founding Fathers to be natural rights that the government cannot violate. And thank God they put those in writing, because those would be violated too. The second part of the Ninth Amendment is called the Rights Retained by the People Clause. This clause states that any rights that naturally belong to human beings like us, you and I, my viewer, and me, the speaker, this clause states that any right that naturally belongs to human beings that are not specifically listed in the Constitution are still protected rights. In other words, the government still cannot infringe on these rights, even though the Constitution doesn't say it can't. Those rights are still retained by the people. Just because the Constitution doesn't say that the government cannot step on those rights, just because the Constitution doesn't say that they can't, that doesn't mean that they can. But the government doesn't see it that way. The government decides what is and what isn't a right, like the right to free travel. If the states weren't making so much money off of the licenses and off of the permits and off of the titles and off of the tabs on your automobile, if they weren't making that much money off of them, the government might stand up for us and say, no, that's not right. He is not a driver, he is a traveler, and he is using his automobile for his personal purpose and personal reasons. But because the states are making so much money, the federal government doesn't want to step in on that cash cow because they're getting a part of that money. The history of the Ninth Amendment. Why was the Ninth Amendment added to the Bill of Rights? After the Constitution was written by the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and submitted to the states for ratification, many voices arose saying the Constitution did not successfully protect the basic natural rights of the citizens. The Anti-Federalist Party, in particular, claimed that let me read that again. The Anti-Federalist Party, in particular, claimed that unless certain rights were spelled out in a Bill of Rights, the government would easily take over these rights and abuse the people, which is what has happened. America, you know this. This is what has happened. It says here that Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason were all of the anti-federalist opinion. They were all of that opinion. They believed that future governments would get stupid, they would get too big for their britches, and they wouldn't have the public's interest at heart. They would have special interest at heart. They would be overtaken by large corporations that could easily buy them. So they decided to put in the Ninth Amendment. Now, James Madison, on the other hand, people in the Federalist Party such as George Washington, John Adams, James Mason, and Alexander Hamilton believed that the Constitution did not give the government the right to do anything that was not specifically stated in it. Therefore, they reasoned that a Bill of Rights was first of all unnecessary, but also possibly dangerous. And why did they think that? Because they thought that if specific rights were listed to be protected from government intrusion, it would imply that any other rights not listed were under the power of the government. James Madison was the primary author of the Constitution. He eventually decided to fight to see a Bill of Rights added, in spite of the fact that he really didn't think it necessary, in order to persuade enough people to join in ratifying the Constitution. On June 8th, 1789, he presented to the First Congress a list of suggested amendments to the Constitution. Referring to this debate about rights not specifically listed, he said this: "It has been objected also against a Bill of Rights that, by enumerating particular exceptions to the grant of power, it would disparage those rights which were not placed in that enumeration. And it might follow by implication that those rights which were not singled out were intended to be assigned into the hands of the general government and were consequently insecure." This is one of the most plausible arguments I have ever heard against the admission of a Bill of Rights into the system, but I conceive that it may be guarded against. I have attempted it, as gentlemen may see by turning to the last clause of the fourth resolution. This passage comes from James Madison's June 8th, 1789 speech to Congress, which presented his suggested amendments. Madison suggested amendments to solve the problem of the government by taking powers that it was not intended to have, was worded like this: "The exceptions here or elsewhere in the Constitution made in favor of particular rights shall not be so construed as to diminish the just importance of other rights retained by the people, or as to enlarge the powers delegated by the Constitution, but either as actual limitations of such powers or as inserted merely for great caution." Congress changed the wording slightly to the amendment that we now know as the Ninth Amendment. So in the end, the Anti-Federalists won the argument and the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. Now, back to my question. What does it mean when it says rights retained by the people? What rights are those? You can say anything is a right if you want to do it bad enough. I have the right to steal someone's land. No, you don't. And the reason you don't is because you're interfering with another person's rights by stealing their land. Therefore, that is not a right. But I do believe that any right that you have is a right as long as it doesn't interfere with anybody else's rights as a whole. I think that the right to free travel using the mode of transportation of the day, and it named off horse-drawn carriage, and it named off buggy, and it also named off automobile when this was talked about by several Supreme Court justices in the early 1900s when the automobile was first getting started. They said, "and automobile," and it was upheld until the states started requiring everybody to have one. Several Supreme Court justices, even in the beginning, struck that down because they said it wasn't right. They said that just because the states want to make it into a privilege doesn't mean that they can do so. So I'll probably do a follow-up video later on the Ninth Amendment, and I'm going to be searching for rights retained by the people. And for anybody that bumps into this video, I'm asking you to help me on this. I need your help. What is the rights retained by the people? What is your version, or what is your opinion on that? What do you think that means? You're the people, you're a citizen, even other countries that might bump into my video by accident, and you happen to like the subject and you have thoughts on the matter, leave it in a comment down below. Take and leave a comment down. Like and subscribe if you happen to like my videos. Like and subscribe, and also leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll get back to you on the comment. Also, I have other videos too. Mostly I talk about Seattle, but because I go by All Things Considered, because I consider all things, every topic that I find important or I find interesting is a topic I will talk about. And on that note, this has been All Things Considered, because I consider all things. Good night, America, and all points beyond.